All right, hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the Big Three on CPA TV. As always, my name is Mihir Torsekar, and I'm joined by my co-host and fellow economist at CPA, Andrew Rechenberg. And we're going to talk to you all about the big three topics happening in trade this week. But before we get to that, we always like to do a quick preview, a rundown of what we're going to be talking about in today's show. So the first item on the agenda, although we did talk a little bit about CPA's most recent report on the Chips for Chips Act, we wanted to talk a little bit more about that report in light of some recent developments regarding the semiconductor supply chain, which essentially kind of carries over the very concerns that we expressed in that report, and that would be China attempting to weaponize their dominance over a critical choke point of the supply chain in semiconductors, which is packaging and assembling final or finished products. So that case of Nexperia is something we want to talk about and how that illustrates a real concern going forward. And then we're going to talk to Andrew. I wanted to turn it over to Andrew to talk about the second and third topics on the agenda today.
Yeah, the second topic for this week is the USMCA review. So CPA recently submitted comments for the USMCA review with the U.S. Trade Representative Office. And our message with these comments are clear. The current framework with these three countries is very broken. It binds two radically different economies, Mexico and Canada, to our own country's much larger market. And all of the benefits seem to go to these other countries, and we're the main market that they are going towards. And it's all binded under this one unenforceable regime. And this entire framework is undermining both U.S. industry and workers. Since this trilateral scheme started with NAFTA, at least 700 to 900,000 jobs have been lost in the U.S. as a direct cause of this trade. And through today, Mexico continues to dump steel, tomatoes, and other manufactured goods into the U.S. market. And it often also acts as a transshipment hub for China. And Canada operates with its own set of different but also equally damaging policies, including strategic subsidies for industries exporting to the U.S., particularly areas like aluminum, and also a lot of supply-managed sectors like lumber and dairy that also displace U.S. producers. And all of this shields their own producers while subsidizing their exports into the U.S. market. And so our message with this report is clear that we need to have two separate agreements with Mexico and Canada, and we also need to restore U.S. trade sovereignty by not having these voluntary restraint agreements. We need to have hard U.S. enforced quotas and two separate deals, one for each country. And for the third topic of this week, we wanted to do an update on beef. So last week, we discussed how beef prices are rising. Consumers see it in the grocery store, but ranchers aren't benefiting. They're seeing lower prices that they're being paid despite high prices in the grocery stores. And the main causes of this are, number one, imports displacing U.S. producers, and number two, the packers who have a cartel-like power over the industry. And the update we have for this week is that President Trump announced that there's going to be a DOJ investigation on price manipulation with these big packers, which control 80 to 85% of the market. And so this is a huge step forward, and it'll be really interesting to see the results of this investigation. So let's get to it with the rest of the segment.
So the first item on the agenda for today's episode is to talk again about our Chips for Chips report that we released about 2 weeks ago. So last week, recall that we talked about the report, some of the key findings. Among the key findings we made was that the U.S., even though we invented the semiconductor in 1947, we have now found that we're in a position where we only produce 10% of the world's chips, only about 8% of the world's mature or legacy chips, so to speak, and less than 1% of the world's most advanced chips that we associate with like AI and the technologies of the future. We talked about the implications of our import dependence. We talked about how conventional trade data tends to underestimate just how reliant we are on imports. So those were all covered last week. But one thing I wanted to point out in that report that we identified was the fact that, in that report, we identified China has shown a penchant for weaponizing choke points in the supply chains that they control over critical industrial supply chains. We talked about rare earth elements in that podcast, last week in the podcast, but also in the report. But more recently, we found evidence that China was doing this now with the semiconductors in the semiconductor space. So we talked in our report about how China has about 30% of the world's capacity for legacy or mature chips. These are the chips that are actually account for the most of the semiconductor capacity in the world today. About 75% of the world's semiconductors that are produced are of these mature legacy chips, and they're indispensable to everything from the cars we drive to the fridges that keep our food fresh to the consumer electronics. And China has gradually been building a choke point in that supply chain. And we see with this Nexperia issue that they've prepared that they are actually deploying that as a key point of leverage in any negotiations. So what happened was the Dutch government owned a company, or they had control over what's now a Chinese-owned company called Nexperia, which makes chips that are critical for like automotive production. And China, in response, essentially decided that they were going to block exports of Nexperia chips. So the Dutch control one part of the supply chain, but in China, a lot of the assembly and final packaging happens there. So again, a choke point in the supply chain is that's where China has leverage. And they were threatening to basically say that, well, we're not going to, we're going to apply export controls and we're not going to export them throughout Europe. And of course, that would have, that would redound throughout the supply chain for the global automotive sector. And it just gives you a preview of how critical this issue is to that we begin to start, breaking away from this idea of like foreign dependence on chips. We can't count on foreign suppliers. We need to start repatriating some of that production that we've given away over the years. And so that was one key point I wanted to highlight about the CHIPS report that we hadn't covered in vivid detail like we can this week. But Andrew, I wanted to turn over to you and hear your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, I think that this whole chips issue is a really good example of how our modern idea of free trade and how that system's supposed to work just is so flawed it does not work anymore. And so if you take an economics class in college or anything like that, you'll hear the terms absolute advantage and comparative advantage and how it just makes sense to have free trade when you're trading wool from England for wine from Portugal or something like that. And you just can't make them as efficiently at either place. And this maybe makes sense in a world where you're trying to decide where to get your wine from. Maybe it doesn't grow as well in northern England or something like that. But today's world is radically different, and it doesn't matter where you make something like a semiconductor. You could make it in Taiwan, you could make it in Iceland, and the manufacturing processes will be the same. It's not environment dependent. But what does matter is that you can construct this absolute or comparative advantage with industrial policy. And that's exactly what a country like Taiwan has done. And that's why they're the most dominant country in this space, because they've invested heavily in their education, their manufacturing capabilities, their facilities, and they've built this system where they are the best in the world. Taiwan doesn't have a natural advantage in being able to build these semiconductors. And we are currently at a disadvantage, but it doesn't have to remain that way. With the right policies, we can build this advantage back, and that's exactly why a policy like this is really needed.
Yeah, great point. I mean, comparative advantage is the way it's taught in the classroom is very simplistic of the two-country model of natural endowments that, give you some advantage that's just neatly, it neatly affords like this kind of commercial relationship where there's no, and by the way, in that world of comparative advantage that they teach in class, there's no trade deficit. Like there's everything is just balanced because everybody is trading what the other doesn't have. So yeah, again, kind of silly, and it's time we move past that framework. So great point on that front. Go ahead and talk to us about the third item, the second item on the USMCA agreement. Comments that we made.
So this week, or recently, the CPA has released its USMCA review comments, and the U.S. Trade Representative Office is conducting a review on the USMCA trade negotiation and taking in comments from the entire industry and really any stakeholders in the country to determine how we should move forward with such agreement. And we've basically had a version of this agreement since the 1990s. It started with NAFTA. It was reviewed, but it's essentially all under this framework of both the U.S. and being tied to Canada and Mexico under one big agreement. And our position as CPA is that this is a fundamentally flawed system to its core. And The core reason behind that is Mexico and Canada are radically different economies. They have radically different manufacturing sectors. We have radically different trade relationships with each of these countries. And at its core, it's very obvious. Canada is a developed country that is capable of industrial policy, and Mexico is a very labor-cheap country where it's easy to do a lot of low-cost manufacturing. And these are fundamentally different economies, yet we've tried to squeeze them into this one-size-fits-all system that is not working for our trade relationship with either one. And we can clearly see this with Mexico dumping products like steel, particularly steel conduit. We had an agreement with Mexico that we would remove our steel tariffs on Mexico to allow in these steel imports, but they had to agree to keep them at historic levels. But we had no enforcement mechanism here, and they've blown past those levels every single year since the agreement. And they've been able to do this because they're a low-cost country and also becoming a transshipment hub for China, especially with a lot of Chinese shops setting up for electric vehicles, for example, and other sectors. Canada, in the meantime, they've had their own problems. They're not a low-cost country, but they have been able to get a cost advantage through stuff like industrial subsidies, particularly for energy-intensive industries like aluminum. And that's subsidizing exports going into the U.S. and displacing our own producers. And so these are very different problems that we're having with each country. And so the natural solution to that is to have two separate agreements, one with Canada and one with Mexico, and we can tailor our trade relationship to each country to account for these particular industries that are going on. And it's a natural approach, and it's consistent with our approach throughout CPA that we need to have specific product by product, industry by industry trade policy, and we need to manage trade on our end. And that's the other fundamental flaw that has allowed Mexico to dump steel, that they basically voluntarily agreed that, oh, we promise we won't export more to you, but when they did export more, and then they agreed, the U.S. didn't have a set quota or a set tariff that we can automatically put in place once they've gone beyond that. And so that's the other element that we need for these. We need hard quotas that are U.S. enforced so that Mexico and Canada simply cannot export more. It's automatically enforced that once you reach a certain limit of exports to U.S. that we agreed upon, it's shut off. Not just this on-paper excuse to say, oh, we promise not to, and then nothing happens if you do. And so that's what we propose for the USMCA review, and we hope that USTR agrees that we need these two very different frameworks for two very different economies.
Yeah, it's interesting because we keep chasing these trade agreements, and we keep signing them, and we keep focusing on the headline, the terms that are agreed to, and that's what we sort of hang our hat on and walk away. But the enforcement element of it is less glamorous. It doesn't really get the headlines, and that is so important. As you mentioned about the agreement that we made with Mexico on the condition of hashing out this USMCA agreement about steel, and then we saw them blow past the agreement that they signed with us because we just overlooked enforcement. And I think that obviously is so crucial, but it's also important to this gives us a chance to make that point clear that when we sign trade agreements with a developed country, it's going to look different from what it looks like with a developing country, where, say, with a developed country, you might be trading on the same platform. You're not really challenging each other over, low wage production or something like that. You're not really dealing with a situation where you're talking about like, labor issues, like human rights issues and things like that. Whereas with Mexico, for example, that's definitely on the table. And multinational corporations have been able to profit off of those low labor costs and some of the exploitative conditions that exist in Mexico that might not exist in Canada. But that's not to say that the issues in Canada aren't real and material, like in the subsidies of softwood lumber, or some of the policies that they extend to their aluminum smelters, for example, that give them an advantage. So I think it's great that we highlighted that, and you absolutely led the effort on that. So it was great that we were able to get those comments in, and again, hopefully USTR is able to take the mantle that we've the argument that we've made. So good work on that. So I'll let you take on the third topic of this week, which is the beef report.
Yeah, so we wanted to give an update on beef for the third topic, and we just reviewed this last week, and we'll do a quick review, but the main new news for this week is that the Trump administration is having a bit of a reversal in their policies, and they've announced that there should be a Department of Justice antitrust investigation against the big meatpackers to investigate price manipulation. And so just to back up on the issue that's going on here in total, beef prices have been rising a lot over the past year, and anyone who's buying beef at the grocery store can tell that. And the Trump administration's initial response was to actually go after and blame the ranchers, saying that the prices of beef are too high and that the ranchers need to be okay with lower prices. And also they actually allowed and increased the amount of imports we can get from Argentina for beef in an effort to try to lower these prices. But as we pointed out last week, this is a very flawed approach. Imports before the increase from Argentina were already at record highs, and yet prices were continuing to rise. And the ranchers themselves aren't benefiting from the high prices. The U.S. cattle herd is at its record low since 1951. And this is because a lot of them are being forced out of business because of low prices. And then it begs the question, how can the ranchers be facing low prices while everyone else at the grocery store is facing high prices? And the answer to that is the middlemen, the Meatpackers, which they operate at about a cartel-like capacity with 80 to 85% market share for the big four Meatpackers. And several of them are foreign-owned as well, with two of the major ones being Brazilian-owned. And so what's happening is that these imports that are coming in are forcing the ranchers, at the behest of the big Meatpackers, to lower their prices that they're actually getting paid for cattle, and basically lowering it to developing country prices from Mexico or Brazil for live cattle from Mexico or for beef from places like Brazil or Argentina. And they're forced to have these low prices. Meanwhile, the Department of Agriculture has documented how the Meatpackers are increasing their profit share by paying less and less for the actual cattle and beef, and then hiking prices at the same time at the grocery store. And they're able to do this because they have this huge market power. And so it's really a great reversal that, while Trump didn't walk back any of the import increases, which would have been a good move to help protect these ranchers from the low prices, they're at least making a good first step to open up this investigation, this antitrust investigation against the big Meatpackers, and specifically calling out their price manipulation and how that's impacting beef prices. And it's very clear that this is happening, and they've already had to settle. One of the big Meatpackers had to settle a big class action lawsuit alleging not only price manipulation on their end, but coordinated price manipulation among the big four Meatpackers. And it's very concentrated market power, but they're also coordinating amongst themselves in order to keep prices low for all the ranchers and raise it at the grocery store. And this is a coordinated effort, and it's really great news that the Department of Justice is moving forward with this investigation. And we hope that Trump will have a similar recognition that the imports are not solving the issue, and it's actually making things worse for the U.S. ranchers. And if things are worse for the U.S. ranchers, that's less of a domestic supply, less beef we're making here at home, and that's just going to make the prices worse in the end as well. So it's a good first step, and we hope that the Trump administration will continue making good ground on this subject.
Well, it's interesting, too, because in this case, we tend to look, as soon as we see any disruption in prices, if prices are spiking, we start thinking, oh, let's just rely on imports, because it's just assumed that we'll just get the cheapest import and that'll solve our problems. Well, you point out that just the nature of certain supply chains, whether it's the Meatpackers middlemen who can affect the prices, like the final sticker price that consumers pay, that sort of neutralizes any cost advantage you get from imports. But then there's the second issue, that is there a quality issue at stake here? And I guess I'm wondering, is there also like a different standard of meat production, I guess, that happens in some of these other countries, that maybe we have more rigorous standards, and that we're by inviting all of these imports in, we're now compromising overall quality for the consumer?
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why these developing countries can afford lower prices, because U.S. ranchers are held to much higher standards, and rightly so. We want to have a safe food supply system. And so that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is these lackluster sanitary conditions in developing countries. And two great examples of that is, in 2000, we initiated restrictions on Argentinian beef because they had disease outbreaks, diseases that weren't in the U.S. since the 1920s. And same thing you can see with Mexico. Just this year, the U.S. had to close off beef and cattle imports from Mexico because there was a huge screwworm outbreak. And so, yeah, if you want to be turned off of beef, look up Mexican screwworm issue, and you'll be worried. And so they're not operating at a fair competition. They're operating at these very low sanitary conditions, and it risks a huge amount to our own food supply. And both in the sense that if we're importing poor quality food, that's bad. But then also if we become reliant on countries like Mexico, and then even if we shut off our border right in time, that makes the supply problem worse if we're relying on this unstable, unsafe supply. We need to be relying on good, high quality, US raised, slaughtered beef.
Yeah, it really gets to this larger issue that I've been thinking about for some time now about how, the false choice that people make that like, oh, if I just get the cheapest priced item, there'll be no sacrifice in quality. It's just simply just a lower priced good and I'm benefiting as a consumer. But that's just not the case. And we see that there is a compromise in quality a lot of the time. And I think it's just so important. This is a perfect example of that. Again, this affects our food supply directly. And what could be more, intimate to the American consumer than the food that they eat? So really great work on that report as well. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, as always. And I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap up this week's episode. So Andrew, thank you for joining me again on this podcast. Everybody, we'll see you next week when we join up again to talk about the next big 3 topics happening in trade. Till then, take care.